Let's turn. We're joined now by Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and contributor to the New Yorker magazine, Charles Duhigg. His piece in the latest issue is entitled "The Pandemic Protocol," which looks at the so-called Epidemic Intelligence Service and the vast differences in death rates from COVID-19 when scientists take the lead instead of politicians. Charles, it's good to have you with us. I think we should start by explaining what the Epidemic Intelligence Service actually is. It's part of the CDC, and as you write in the story, its alumni are sort of scattered across the country working on coronavirus.
That's exactly right. The EIS alumni are considered the shock troops for any time that there's a pandemic in the United States or even worldwide. They're sort of the pride and joy, the crown jewels of the epidemiologists that we have, and they oftentimes head some of the largest health departments in the world, including in Los Angeles and Philadelphia and Chicago. And so they're really this important asset, and they know not only how to treat a pandemic, but equally importantly, how to communicate during a pandemic. Because a pandemic is a communication emergency as much as it is a medical emergency.
So, Charles, where are some of the points of contrast we can look to explain the phenomenon you write about in this piece? Where has communication and science been good? Where have scientists led? And where have we not seen that as much?
Well, in Seattle, which was the original epidemic, the original epicenter of the outbreak, if you'll remember, what we saw was that we saw political leaders almost immediately hand communications to the scientists. And in doing so, what they did is they enabled those scientists to use the tools they have to create trust with the population. Oftentimes, they were calling for things even before they were orders, like work from home. Microsoft, even before anyone at Microsoft was sick, asked its employees to work from home, similarly with Amazon. And that cut the number of cars on the road alone by 100,000 each day, which meant that everyone inside Seattle knew something serious is going on here. We need to take this seriously. Now, if you look at New York in contrast, you see a very different situation. When the outbreak started in New York at about the same time as in Seattle, what you saw was de Blasio and Cuomo, but most importantly de Blasio, saying things to try and calm people's fears, to not allow them to panic, saying that this is probably going to pass, it's going to be okay. And most importantly, de Blasio was fighting with his Department of Health. And instead of putting the scientists front and center in front of the cameras, de Blasio was moving in front of the cameras and was often saying things that his Department of Health were telling him were inaccurate or that they felt damaged people's health.
And what about on the national level, Charles? Do we have members or graduates, alumni from this Epidemic Intelligence Service inside the federal government? Do we see them advising the president? Are any of them on this task force for coronavirus created by the White House?
None of them are on the task force. We do have a number of EIS graduates all throughout the federal government, most importantly at the CDC. But one of the most challenging things of what's going on right now is that the CDC has effectively been silenced and sidelined. Now, if you look at the H1N1 outbreak, right, which was a pandemic that started here in the United States and very serious, it killed over 12,000 people, 700 schools shut down. What you saw was that the CDC was at the forefront of the communications about how people should respond. Richard Besser, who was then the acting director of the CDC, was up in front of the cameras every single day. He was replaced by Tom Frieden, who became the director of the CDC. And at the beginning of this crisis, if you'll remember, the CDC did take the lead on communications. And in fact, we saw them following the rule book, the rules that have been worked out over 100 years and polished about how to talk to people during a crisis. And one of those rules being try not to put politicians in front of the camera. Obama only spoke about H1N1 a handful of times because they didn't want to politicize the response. And the first time he did talk about it, he complimented the Bush administration. Now, as soon as the pandemic landed on American shores, that's when the White House began stepping in. And I think as a result, you've seen a real diminishment in the communications and in people understanding exactly what they ought to be doing and how to make sense of what's going on.
Yeah, a lot of people would like to see Drs. Fauci and Birx out front and center, but it's been the president by and large. We'll be reading that fascinating new piece in the new issue of The New Yorker. Charles Duhigg, thanks so much, Charles. Good to see you this morning.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.